speakers, because what I want to talk about today is the way in which British politics is very much framed and shaped by its religious history. So I'm going to talk about my current British Academy funded research on faithful citizens. And this morning I'm going to focus on the really quite thrilling early years of the period. My project starts in 1789, the year of the French Revolution. So what was so extraordinary about the French Revolution, and why did British writers care so much about what was happening across the Channel? It's difficult to convey the excitement of those years. But one of the key ideas that everyone is writing about and talking about is liberty. So this image of liberty by Delacroix, of liberty leading the French revolutionaries into triumph, was reprised this time last year, as some of you may remember, by the French crowds who marched down Paris streets, reaffirming the French Revolution slogans of liberty, fraternity and equality after the bombing of the Charlie Hebdo offices. In the 21st century version, the flag is replaced by pencil, reaffirming the right to freedom of speech. And this constellation of rights, liberty, and publishing is also central to 18th century debates. So in 1789, protesters tore down the iconic French prison, the Bastille, and began to demolish what they saw as the corrupt monarchy and oppressive Roman Catholic Church. For many then and now, French liberty here is the figure of enlightenment, using the light of reason to reveal the truth about power and celebrate the potential of humanity. This is the triumph of secularization. But I think we're too quick to claim we're rational creatures and to assert that Western politics is something free from religion. I think we need to be more aware of our history and of where our claims to, say, national liberty might originate. And to show you how fascinating and rich the relationship between religion and politics was in the 1790s, I'm going to talk about a writer called Anna-Letitia Barbauld and her circle. Now, this group of men and women were dissenters or nonconformists, which meant that they were Protestants who worshipped outside of the Church of England. Barbauld and her friends were mostly Presbyterians and Unitarians, but it doesn't really matter about denomination here. What matters is whether you worship within the Church of England or outside of it. If you didn't worship within the Church of England, you were penalised and excluded from full citizenship rights, though you still had to pay taxes. Of course, if you were a woman, we had to wait till 1928 for equal voting rights anyway. Here we have this group of very talented, law-abiding people who are discriminated against. So why? They're perceived by the establishment as suspect because they're descendants of Puritan revolutionaries who beheaded Charles I in 1649. British ideas of liberty are always complicated by this history, as we'll see. Britain liked to see itself, and it still does very much like to see itself, as the nation of liberty because of its Protestantism. It had a reformed church, free of the corrupt power associated with the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope. But many dissenters thought that the Church of England, the Houses of Parliament, still needed further reform if Britain was to claim to be the land of liberty. Liberty, then, is a quality that everyone wanted to claim as their own, but was defined in many different ways. Here we have one of my favourite images, cartoons of the period, British response to the claims of French liberty. So we have British liberties, Britannia, sedate, prosperous on one side, and on the other hand, we have French liberty, which is clearly bad and involves decapitation and mad women with snakes for hair. It's quite a crude but effective political tool here. So, in case you weren't clear why which is best, there is a helpful list of reasons underneath the medallions. I particularly like, underneath French liberty, equality, madness and cruelty, along with murder and anarchy. That's what equality leads to. So, just to make things more exciting, while this was going on in France, in Britain, dissenters were petitioning Parliament for full citizenship. But the dissenting campaign was damaged by the association of Protestant dissent with French radicalism. The Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, opposed the repeal of the dissenting penalties in 1790 because he thought that, quote, the motion for reform was nothing more than the preliminary to the overthrow of the entire system of our present government. The best constitution, he said, that ever was found on the whole habitable globe. So, here we have another contemporary cartoon, and you can see here that, I haven't got time to go in detail, but you can see here that we have the proposers of the repeal of the penalties portrayed as Cromwell, and indeed the King's Head, just to remind us what happens if you give citizenship rights to dissenters. They end up chopping off the King's Head. So this caused real division within communities. You have set a mark of separation upon us, wrote Barbauld. And suddenly communities which had happily coexisted were torn apart by the sudden visibility of difference. In Birmingham, for example, mobs gathered to burn effigies and attack the houses and churches of dissenters. Barbauld's friend, the dissenting scientist Joseph Priestley, lost his library, his house and laboratory and nearly his life in these riots, and he ended up fleeing to America. There's real division. This is the house, the school belonging to the Warrington Worthies, the circle that Barbauld belonged to. The Warrington Worthies were a group of intellectuals and very diverse interests, but at the core, here, we have three generations of Aiken family. At the top you have the school that they ran, which was very influential, and the printing press. So here we have education and publication together with these dissenting thinkers. Joseph Priestley and his wife were good friends with Barbauld's family early in the 18th century. He had taught alongside John Aiken in the Warrington Academy. And this circle of friends and family, a particularly fabulous example of the groups of men and women that I'm interested in for this project. They're brought together over ideas, and the community is fired by the desire to think, to write, to teach. You can see the school and the printing press presiding over this community of thinkers. Barbauld is here in the middle, there, and flanked by her father and her brother, and then there's the next generation, her niece and nephews. In 1822, the influential magazine, The Monthly Repository, described this family as, quote, one which has perhaps done more than any other family in England for the promotion of knowledge and the gratification of literary taste. And they really weren't exaggerating. Barbauld herself wrote under her own maiden name and married names, but also published the anonymous Civic Sermons and Sins of Government, Sins of the Nation in 1793. And the print form allowed her to preach anonymously where she couldn't, as a woman, take the pulpit in her own church. The print public becomes this place where Barbauld, doubly excluded from public office as a woman and as a dissenter, could comment on her nation's politics and educate her readers and listeners into doing so themselves. So here we have a writer publishing under the title of a volunteer. She's getting rid of her own individual identity and taking on a role, a citizen speaking to other citizens. So here we have the interior of a Church of England church. And in many ways, this is partly what the beauty, the history was what dissenters found both deeply attractive and problematic, associated with the Roman Catholic Church. The Warrington thinkers saw the church as an important gathering place for the community. It brings together a cross-section of people who might otherwise never meet. Young and old, male and female, rich and poor, literate and illiterate, they're a body of people in a shared space, and they're keen to use this as a basis as a shared civic identity. It's a radical vision because it cuts across the usual divides of age, gender and class. And they see citizenship as beginning at home, and this is, I think, particularly exciting. Ideas of government, they argue, should be as familiar to children as any other topic of familial conversation. But where the Church of England Book of Common Prayer emphasises loyalty to the monarch and obedience to the laws, many dissenting churches were questioning the established social hierarchy. So dissenters refused to be silenced by the rejection of their petition for full citizen rights. And Barbauld writes, although the mark of separation might be visible socially, Parliament can't stop the circulation of ideas through books. You will read our books, you will imbibe our sentiments, she writes. Big deal, you might say. But literature, in its then current broader sense of print culture, was a realm full of possibility. Few engines can be more powerful than literature, observed the radical philosopher William Godwin, 1793, and his Tory opponents agreed. Literature was the powerhouse of the future. And these dissenting writers were hugely influential across all fields of knowledge, extending from the discovery of oxygen to writing about experiments with electricity, to travel writing, poetry, history, anthologies. They were unstoppable. So their messages were often unsettling, forcing their readers to judge for themselves and to be questioning readers, not passive subjects. When in Sins of Government, Sins of the Nation, Barbauld translates the King's orders for a national day of fasting to ensure success in the war, she points out that we're only praying for a nation, as a nation, for God to bless the slaughter of one nation by another, and criticises nations for all believing that they are God's chosen ones, God's favourite country. So here readers are being asked to think in terms of morality rather than nation. Do we believe in the war being fought in our name as a nation? The question of human rights, above the rights of nations, was being debated during these same years. You see why they're so fascinating. This is the time when the anti-slave trade movement, the abolitionist campaign, took off in Britain, and liberty was again key in these debates. On the one side, opposers of the slave trade emphasised the shame of Britain, supposedly country of liberty, being heavily involved in the slave trade, and on the other, plantation owners argued for the liberty to trade in whatever goods they chose. Taken to its radical conclusion, the argument was that as we are all equal before God, every time social worship is celebrated, it includes a virtual declaration of the rights of man. And Barbauld was one of the several writers who innovatively used poetry to argue their case. I still get a thrill reading Barbauld using poetry to enter the Houses of Parliament and address the MP, William Wilberforce, fellow campaigner. She opens the poem, "Cease, Wilberforce," just give up. They're not listening to you. And it's as though she's standing up and saying, cease Osborne or Obama, naming him as an equal. Here again, we've got the power of books to lift the voice of a woman with no vote or civic powers into the heart of political debate. So we're back to the Houses of Parliament. Barbauld's actually using her poem to bring alive the Houses of Parliament. She's using eyewitness accounts to describe the scorn and laughter that Wilberforce's horrific descriptions of slave torture and death met with. Like the bid for citizenship rights the previous year, the bill for ending slavery failed in 1791. It wasn't fully outlawed until 1833. And as you may know, the slave trade is still thriving today. There are an estimated 13,000 slaves in our country and 21 to 30 million globally. So the sin in this quotation are the sins of slavery, war and injustice. But there's a positive side to this talk of sin. If we're all of us involved in the sins of the government, then we have the power to change and to reform. So when she urges people who in your individual capacities are rich and poor, high and low, governors and governed, assemble yourselves in the unity of your public existence, rest from your ordinary occupations, give a different direction to the exercise of your public worship, confess not every man his own sins, but the sins of all, she's offering churches as a place of power, a place of potential government. So, as I hope I've shown, in rethinking the relationship between faith, gender and citizenship in the late 18th, early 19th century, we can encounter some surprising and often inspiring roads not taken, paths which might offer ways to re-engage a voting public alienated by the still very privileged, Eton-dominated Westminster. There are suggestive parallels between the burgeoning print culture of that period and the revolution in protest politics today. I'm thinking here of Twitter and the Arab Spring, growth of online activism. We need to think about politics and the public in ways which will make responsible citizenship less abstract and more of a lived identity. As my dissenting writers argued, child or adult, man or woman, the present and the future of the world depend upon it.